All right, and how should we view? I know we spoke about this off the camera before, but about how the theologians like Balthasar, Rahner, Delubach. I mean, different people, different stance on things. Some of whom, I think, during the pre-Vatican II period, claiming to be Thomists, right, transcendental Thomists. How should we view them? How do we put any of that in perspective? And even like the communio theology, the Eucharistic theology. How do we put that all in perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we have to realize is that basically the period from, I want to say 1840, 1850, around there, to 1950, 1960, this was a period of great renewal within the church when it came to the type of sources that we had access to. So the example that I like to give, because this is kind of a funny example, I would say, is the example of Gregory Palamas. So Gregory Palamas, he's an Eastern Orthodox theologian who was in opposition to Rome. He's one of the pillars of orthodoxy for the Eastern Orthodox, very popular figure. But who were the first ones to go through all the manuscripts of Gregory Palamas' works and to make critical editions of it? It was a Latin. The Latins were the ones who went through all of these different Eastern Orthodox figures and made critical editions of all of their works, or at least made some sort of print edition of all of their works. And actually, it was us going through, getting all of these works, making editions of them, commenting on them, and then giving them back to the Eastern Orthodox. They hadn't really had primary source access to a lot of these individuals until we gave them the theologians back. And it just kind of led to a weird historical interpretation, because they interpreted it like our, which in a few ways were slightly wrong. So they just took the wrong reading that our theologians had of their theologians, and then just said, yeah, that's orthodoxy. It's really a strange story with that one, but it's kind of a story for a different day. But basically, this was a period of great retrieval throughout the entire history of the church. So you see, for a great example of this would be the works of Cardinal Johann Baptist Franzlin from the 1860s to 1880s, I think was when he's writing, or of Shaven. Shaven's another figure. Great period of retrieval, going back to a lot of the sources. We were having access to systematic presentations of the church fathers, of the medievals. It was a period in which we did a lot of primary source work. So during this period, you had a lot of really great secondary source work going on and great primary source work going on. So that is the context in which the Nouvelle Theologie, which are the figures that you're referring to, the Nouvelle Theologie, arose. They arose in a context in which they were particularly known for the great, fantastic, excellent historical work that they were doing. We have to remember is that when you look at manuals that were written in the 40s and the 50s, these guys are being quoted as authorities, or even into the 60s. These guys are being quoted as authorities. They're being quoted as, these guys are great historical theologians. They're doing a lot of great work. But they did have particular theses that they were bringing out. They had particular views that they held on to, and conclusions they drew from their historical work. So the theologians at the time, the scholastics at the time, the way that they basically approached it is they used all of their great historical work. They used all of their great their great secondary source material, but they were very careful about the conclusions that they drew. Because in many cases, the conclusions that they drew were either not sufficiently precise. So the theologians of the time were like, okay, well, this is what you're saying. If taken in this sense, like it's not cool. But we need to be very careful about what you're saying here. Or in many cases, the thesis ends up just being wrong. So we value the type of good work that they put in. We have to be careful with the unique contributions that they're making. And this is something which is not at all unique to the Nouvelle Theologie. Very many times throughout the history of theology, you have eclectic figures who attempt to come in and to state a new position on something. And that's fine. You're trying to figure out a new solution to old problems in submission to the magisterium, in line with divine revelation. It's okay. It's called being an eclectic. Being an eclectic is completely fine. There's no sin in being an eclectic. We have to be careful is that eclectic positions are meant to be judged by the mature. So the theologians in their journal articles or monographs, which monographs are basically long, long journal articles, about 100 to 150 pages. So in their journal articles and their monographs, they would discuss these issues amongst themselves as theologians who were already formed as competent men who could consider these problems. But the issue with the 1960s and on, and to this day, it wasn't the fact that they were presenting these new ideas. It's completely fine to be an eclectic. It was the ideology that we should be very free in presenting our new conclusions to the masses, especially to seminarians. So in a previous age, when you had these new ideas which came forward, theologians would dispute it, and it'd be fine. Eventually, maybe it would be a position that a lot of theologians would like, and therefore it would be included as a small portion, a scholia, within the general theological manual. And maybe eventually a lot of theologians like it. And eventually there's a consensus on this. It's so good there's a consensus on it. And then maybe eventually the magisterium of the church decides to step in and maybe give some sort of approbation of it. That's completely possible. That's the way that authentic doctrinal development happens. But the way that authentic doctrinal development doesn't happen is you try to brainwash all the seminarians into holding all of your views with insane rhetoric, which I know I've been very respectful to a lot of these people, but that's what they did. In the 60s and 70s, they tried to overturn the entire tradition with rhetoric, with the way in which they spoke very nastily about the previous tradition, which are foundational for a lot of the myths that we have about the preconciliar theology to this day. So yeah, that's generally speaking. I think that I have a very balanced position. I think I have the same position that the theologians before the councils held about the Nouvelle Theology. I just need to grab my charger.
Sure.
Wouldn't want me disappearing halfway through, right?
I don't even think I have my microphone. Do you hear my microphone? I'm like,
yeah, I can hear your microphone.
Oh, okay. It didn't look like it was on here for some reason. I thought it was just going through the computer. Yeah, no, because I was thinking with these guys before, like you were saying, that's more. Those guys were schooled with Thomism or Neo-Scholasticism, right?
Yeah.
So like Ratzinger, JP2, who were talking about communio and Eucharistic theology, they had this solid foundation, whereas their students didn't. I don't know if it was them personally, but the people in their cohort who were teaching, they weren't teaching with that solid foundation, or was the cohort following that?
Yeah. Basically, what happened is a lot of these, and it's crazy because you read, like Rahner, for example. Rahner was a Jesuit, and Rahner had a very high regard for theological manuals. A lot of these guys, in very many ways, had a high regard for theological manuals, for their content, and even in some cases for their method. Because you have to realize a lot of these guys were trained in seminaries in a certain way, in the scholastic method. And that's what made them great. That's what formed their native scientific faculties in such a way as to be able to produce such good quality work. And it's kind of a tragic tale, because, and I think I'm justified in speaking this way, but basically what you see in the history of theology is you see this brilliant group of the Nouvelle Theology. I mean, this would be obviously Benedict XVI and St. John Paul II would be included in this group, who you mentioned. But this brilliant group who were trained in this method, and who had the scientific habits they had because of this, because they were trained in this way. And then once the council happened and a lot of the reforms were put into place, a lot of these methods of theology fell by the wayside and kind of came up to a almost nihilistic throwing of opinions at one another. So basically, everybody kind of has their own theological opinion. We don't have any sort of general way of acquiring certainty of who's right. We don't really have a way of coming to a consensus or any sort of agreement on any points. And this was very tragic. And the students following them were not trained in the same method. So they were given the matter. So they were given the matter from the Nouvelle Theology, so what they were kind of saying, but they weren't given the form. They weren't anywhere near as brilliant. And you see this where to now, I mean, you read a lot of these guys, and it's just completely unimpressive work. These guys aren't, they don't know 12 different languages and aren't, can quote like Bonaventure's fourth book of the sentences off their head when a certain problem comes up, like Ratzinger could do, or like even St. John Paul II, just brilliant, insanely well-read, very bright figures, and their students are, in many ways, just completely unimpressive. And a lot of the ones who are impressive do hold to the value of the older way of doing things. And a lot of the other ones are just riffing off of what had already been said in like 1942. They're saying the same thing that was already said in 1942 and pretending that this is unique or new, and holding to these just like kind of nasty rhetorical caricatures of how theology was before the council.
Okay. I had a whole list of questions I could ask. I'm going to scrap all that. I'm going to save this as the last one. If you could rewrite the curriculum in terms of training students, for all Catholics, Catechesis, seminarians, and just the entire mode of doing theology, you have the magic wand, and you could write the script. What would it look like? How would you have them rooted in that Thomism all at the same time? Well, because obviously things are said at Vatican II, and you do have these theologians, so that we're able to have a proper development of doctrine and understand things right. What would you do?
I would want nothing more than what basically every single council father of Vatican II wanted. When you look at and I've read them all, if you look at the votae that were written to the Second Vatican Council, especially the ones on education, and you read what did the council fathers going into Vatican II, how would they have critiqued the way in which theology was being done? Because theology was being done in a very good way before Vatican II. We were reaching some of the heights in the history of theology, some of the heights in many different areas of the greatness of our theologians during the 1950s. But there are definitely ways in which we could improve. And the ways in which a lot of the bishops said we needed to improve is that we needed to put manuals back in their proper place, which was not manuals were meant to be basically assisting books. Your seminarians would be reading them in private, not during the lecture or anything like that. They'd be kind of getting all the information of the who, what, where, why, when, how sort of stuff. They'd be getting, okay, well, these X number of fathers, these are the traditional scripture passages that we go to. You'd be kind of building up all the matter sort of within you, to kind of use that analogy.
The skeleton,
and,
kind of.
Yeah, you're building up all of that knowledge that you're not just going to cover in class. Like, you're not going to go in class and say, hey, let me read off these 30 different texts from church fathers about the divine processions. Like, you're not going to do that. So that's the role of manuals. But the role of the magister, so the master in the classroom, is to interpret and to show the unity of theology through the exposition of a master text of theology. And that master text for the bishops going into Vatican II was the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas is ordered in such a way as to show the unity of theology and the way in which all of the different pieces and aspects fit together. That's the strength of the Summa. Even if theologians interpreted the Summa and disagreed with the conclusion of St. Thomas, it's the order of study that matters. It's the general way in which he fits together all of the pieces. So that's what the fathers going into Vatican II wanted. They wanted the manuals to be put in their proper places and the Summa of St. Thomas. So the students, when they were learning about the Trinity, rather than being thrown 10 different theses about the Trinity like the manuals did, and that's of course fine to throw 10 different theses and to show, okay, these are the objections, this is how we handle the objections, here are the definitions from the church, here's scripture, here's tradition. That's fine. It's fine to do that, of course, it's okay. But in the classroom, the magister is supposed to, through his teaching, by way of illustration, by way of corollary, many different ways, supposed to show how the entirety of the Catholic faith is this sort of beautiful unity. It's this sort of cathedral of truth. and that's what's supposed to happen in the classroom. So if there's anything that I could wave the magic wand and change everything on, it would be, okay, we need to update our manuals because it's been a while. I mean, some of the last ones were being written in the 70s, but it's definitely been a while. We need to update these to stop just spouting out your random personal opinions in your theology textbooks for students. That's stupid. As a theologian, your obligation towards your students is to give the teaching of, one, the church, and two, your school. So if you're a Jesuit, you give the teaching generally of the Society of Jesus. If you're a Dominican, you give the general teaching of the order of preachers and the way in which they interpret St. Thomas, and so on and so forth. That's your obligation as a theologian, not to give your own personal interpretation or your own personal opinions. It's to give the teaching of your order, to give the teachings of the magisterium of the church, and so on. There's been a lot of magisterial stuff that has happened in the last 70, 80 years since the great manuals were last being written. And there were a lot of different opinions that were being put forward that need to be particularly refuted. But we need to get those manuals updated and get those as assistant works for students in seminaries. And we need the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas to be interpreted again. And I mean, this is just my lay opinion, but I'm not saying this because I'm particularly brilliant or anything like that. I'm saying this because that's kind of just what the bishops of the entire church wanted as the reform, and instead we got the tyranny of individual theologians who were all brilliant, but in many ways messed up the way in which teaching was done. So yeah, I think if I were to wave the magic wand, that would kind of be what would be going on.
And then how do you start? Well, take your son. How would you start Augustine? How would you start exposing him to things?
I think what's important is, at least for kids in that age, it would be most of their exposures can be happening through the liturgy. So daily office, I love the daily office. I'm an Anglican ordinariate, so my daily office is a little bit different than the liturgy of the hours. It's going to be the reading of Scripture and the explanation of Scripture. I mean, the fathers universally talk about how Scripture is something where the image that Pope St. Gregory the Great uses is it's kind of like a river. You can have the little lamb kind of splash around in the shallows of the river, but the hippo also can like swim in the depths of the middle and can't touch the bottom. So Scripture is something that, in learning how to properly read Scripture, that's something that from a very young age is very important. And this isn't something that you need to be a brilliant mega genius for. You can be a kid and be reading Scripture and learning generally, like, okay, what are these Bible stories? What's the significance of them, both morally, allegorically, and anagogically? What is the significance of them for my life, for viewing Christ in them, for beatitude, for heaven? What's the significance to all of those things? I don't really have any extremely special thoughts on youth catechesis. I do actually really like the compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's probably what I will use or adapt with my children. It's very, very good, and it kind of is a self-contained system too, because you can go to the compendium of the Catechism, and then you can go up to the big boy Catechism, which is more so, something appropriate for probably young teens would be able to, they'd be able to read it with an assistant for sure.
All things equal, would you go with the compendium over like one of the more advanced Baltimore catechisms? Or it doesn't matter?
The only reason I would go with the compendium is I do want to instill in my children the fact that the stuff that the church produces is stuff that is relevant to us. And by the stuff that the church produces, I mean the stuff that the contemporary church produces. I think for a lot of people, and I've noticed this with individuals that I interact with on a daily basis, is, of course, the Roman Catechism is great. Of course, the Baltimore Catechism is great. Of course, all of these different historical catechisms of the church are great. They're amazing. They're wonderful. But what you lose is a lot of times you can cause a mentality of suspicion towards the contemporary magisterium of the church. is what the magisterium of the church now gives us isn't good anymore, and we kind of need to go back and read the stuff that the magisterium used to give us.
Right. Okay. So would you do them in conjunction, or just go straight to the compendium?
I think for young children, at least, from my experience, I used to do catechetics as an Anglican. Repetition is extremely important, so I'd probably stick with the same text.
Okay. All right. And then when would you introduce them to the Summa? Is that a high school thing? Is that a college thing? Or is that more... I know it was made for beginners, which is...
Yeah,
right.
well, beginners were students who had studied arts already. So they were already actually bachelors in arts. They'd studied philosophy for probably 4 or 5 years at that point. So beginner means something a little bit different than for us. Which, to be fair, I mean, they started studying the arts at like 12, 13 years old. So it would have been our equivalent of high school students, late high school. But yeah, when it comes to the works of St. Thomas, what is excellent about them is that they're just so varied. I mean, there's different works that are basically applicable for children. There's other works that are applicable for younger adults. There are like things like the explanation of the Lord's Prayer, the explanation of the Hail Mary, explanation of these various parts, scripture commentaries. There's various different works within the corpus of St. Thomas that are easy for laymen, even uneducated laymen, to read and digest. And there's stuff that's very hard as well that could be introduced later on. There's actually an interesting side comment that's made during the canonization process of St. Thomas, that even the what is it? Even the ignorant would fight for to grab a work of St. Thomas, basically, because he was beloved by the laymen who would read his simpler works, such as his explanations of the Ten Commandments, Creed, Our Father, and Ave, and works like On the Reasons for the Faith, and certain sermons. There's his scripture commentaries. There's a bunch of stuff that people who aren't theological geniuses could be very accessible for them.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Christian. Great stuff. Really appreciate it. A lot of your work. I saw the whole series on development of doctrine. That was great going through, and double predestination, making the distinctions and explaining that. Just a lot of great stuff. Any other information, or where can we send people to find more information from you, your work, and what you have going on coming up?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of a lot of different things, but yeah, I have a Twitter. It's mostly like a personal Twitter. I mean, I kind of just meme on it or whatever. I mean, it's not really like super official. Sometimes I'll do theology stuff on it. Sometimes I'll just troll people on it. I mean, it's kind of whatever. I have a YouTube channel, obviously, Scholastic Answers. I do live streams, some live streams during the week. Those are more supposed to be just like hanging out, more entertaining stuff. It's not really anything super dense. Some people like the live streams. Some people, I also do edited videos, which usually end up being more dense and are edited, concise, everything like that. Those usually are the ones where some people say, okay, well, I find live streams boring or whatever. I don't like that stuff. I'd rather just watch the edited videos. It's like, well, I do both. So, yeah, either one of those, I live stream and I post edited videos. And I also do, I've been translating stuff, and I do works. Well, that is behind a paywall. It's on my Patreon. Is most of, my weird scholastic notes. I've been chasing down something on a guy named Vincent Contenson and his particular view of what constitutes theology as a habit. So, I mean, if that's your sort of thing, I do post that on my Patreon, and I'm translating through Billiwart Summa Sume on there as well. So yeah, those are the main places. I have a website as well, christianbwagner.com. That just has various things on there. But yeah, that's all the stuff that I do.
Awesome, Christian. I'll give you a plug too, helping with the tutoring. So I signed up for several tutoring sessions, and I'm sure we'll be doing it again. But it's been really helpful. I saw that. That's just a great thing. You're able to just And I shoot all these kinds of questions at you, and you're knocking them down. So it's really helpful in your recommendations. So I'd strongly recommend anyone who watches to capitalize on that. It's your wealth of information and generous with your time. So I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
All right.